The air in the grand hall of the FIA's new Zurich headquarters was thick with the scent of polished mahogany and unstated power. It was the kind of power you could feel in the quiet hum of the climate control, in the way every conversation was held in hushed, respectful tones. This wasn't a press conference, it was a summit. The annual FIA Leadership Gala, where the real strings of Formula One were pulled, far from the cameras and the public grandstanding. I stood by a floor-to-ceiling window, a glass of something fizzy in my hand that I hadn't yet tasted, watching the early evening light fade over the Alps. The mountain ranges were a stark, formidable contrast to the smooth, controlled environment of the hall. My own power, the one people knew, the one that came from a car and a stopwatch, felt almost irrelevant in this room. Here, it was about political capital, about alliances forged over champagne and polite half-truths. It was a game I'd been forced to learn, not by choice, but by necessity. After Abu Dhabi, after the endless scrutiny and the seismic shift in the sport's leadership, I knew that being the fastest wasn't enough. You had to control the narrative, own the ground you stood on, or someone else would decide it for you. Across the room, Lewis Hamilton was the center of his own gravitational field. He was the one in his element here, surrounded by team principals, corporate sponsors, and politicians who saw him not just as a champion, but as a symbol. He had built a brand that transcended racing, a platform that spoke to a broader audience about social justice and global change. Tonight, he was the main event. He was set to deliver the keynote address, the highlight of the entire evening, a speech about the future of the sport, about responsibility, about whatever new ground he wanted to claim. I saw Lando Norris talking to one of the FIA's board members, a man whose family fortune was old enough to be carved in stone. Lando, with his easy smile and boyish charm, was the perfect conduit for the elite. He was part of the system, born into a world where these galas were just Tuesday nights. He moved through the crowd with a natural grace, a stark contrast to my own feeling of being a well-dressed predator, always scanning for an angle. I had a respect for Lando, a deep, professional respect. He was clever, a brilliant driver, but his political game was different from mine. His was one of integration. Mine was one of disruption. He worked within the system. I was always looking for the pressure points to make it bend. The room began to fall silent as Lewis was introduced. He walked to the podium with the practiced poise of a man who had done this 1,000 times. He was a master of the stage, the kind of person who could make a crowd of skeptical billionaires hang on his every word. The lights dimmed slightly, and a spotlight bathed the podium. "Friends, colleagues, and members of this incredible community," he began, his voice a low, resonant baritone that carried easily through the hall. "We stand at a crossroads, not just in racing, but in our world. And it is our duty, our responsibility, to use this platform, this incredible spectacle of human ingenuity and speed, to drive change." It was a good start, powerful, evocative, the kind of talk that made people feel good about themselves and the money they were spending. He spoke of sustainability, of diversity, of making the sport accessible to every child, regardless of their background. His words were a masterclass in rhetoric, a beautiful tapestry of ideals that everyone in the room could applaud, whether they truly believed in them or not. I took a slow sip of my drink. It was a sharp, citrusy spritz. My own approach to these issues was more practical, less performative, less about grand speeches, more about quiet, focused action. I had my own foundation, my own initiatives, but they were not for public consumption at a gala. To me, the work spoke for itself. This, however, was Lewis's domain, the public stage where perception was everything. He was in the middle of a particularly moving passage, a story about a young kid from a working-class background who found a path into racing through a new grassroots program. The crowd was captivated. There were a few sniffles, a ripple of quiet admiration. Then, it happened. He paused. It wasn't a dramatic rhetorical pause for effect. It was an abrupt, jarring silence. He looked down at his notes, a flicker of something unreadable. Panic? Confusion? Crossing his face. He lifted his head, his eyes scanning the crowd, but his gaze seemed to fix on nothing. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He tried again, a silent, almost painful exhale. The rhythm of the room, so perfectly aligned with his speech just moments before, was broken. The quiet hum was replaced by a tense, anticipatory silence. A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Lando, across the room, looked on with a mix of surprise and concern. He made a subtle move, a step forward as if to help, but he stopped himself. This was Lewis's moment, and an intervention would only make it worse. The silence stretched, a vacuum of sound that seemed to suck the very air from the room. It was agonizing. A public figure, a master of his craft, caught in a moment of utter vulnerability. He was trapped, mid-sentence, on a stage he had so expertly commanded. And then his eyes met mine. From across the room, the distance felt immense. But in that moment, our connection was absolute. It was a flash of something I knew all too well. The feeling of a misfire on the track, a sudden loss of control. In his gaze, there was the silent, almost desperate plea of a man who needed an exit, any exit. But there was also a challenge. A subtle, almost imperceptible tilt of his head that seemed to say, "Don't you dare." He knew what I was thinking. He knew the unspoken rules of this game. You didn't interrupt a rival's moment of weakness. You let them fall. You let the chink in the armor be seen. It was the unwritten code of the political paddock. But for all the years of rivalry, all the championships, all the hard-fought battles, this wasn't the track. This was something different. This was a man, a human being, stuck on a precipice. The crowd was a coiled spring, ready to recoil in embarrassment. The cameras, though not live, would capture this image, this moment of brokenness, and it would be replayed endlessly. This was a crisis, not for him, but for the sport's entire image. The polished veneer was cracking, and it was happening on Lewis Hamilton's watch. And in that brief, suspended moment, with Lewis's gaze fixed on mine, I saw a path. A way to not just navigate the situation, but to outmaneuver him in a way he would never see coming. It wasn't about being the hero, not in the classic sense. It was about being the one who understood the game better than anyone else in the room. It was about turning his weakness into my strength, but in a way that was so unexpected, so counterintuitive, it would redefine the rules of engagement. I took another sip of my drink, the citrus a sharp, cold jolt. I put the glass down on a nearby table, my eyes never leaving his. The silence hung between us, a shared understanding of what was at stake. The public stage was set, and the first act had just gone terribly dramatically wrong. But the real performance I knew was about to begin, and it would not be a solo act. The silence was the longest minute of my life. A public figure's worst nightmare, played out in front of the very people who held the levers of power in the sport. Lewis was a statue, frozen at the podium, his mouth a silent O. I saw the network cameras, mercifully not live streaming, but recording every agonizing second. This would be a highlight reel of a different kind, not of victory, but of public failure. His gaze never wavered from mine. In that look, I saw the raw, unfiltered Lewis. Not the champion, not the activist, but the man backed into a corner. And I saw the challenge. It was a dare. He knew what was happening. He knew the unwritten rule that you don't step in. You let your rival suffer a public setback. You might feel a flicker of sympathy, but you don't intervene. An intervention would be an admission of his weakness. a concession to my strength. And he would never, ever want that. But that look, there was something else there too. A flicker of something predatory. A trap. A thought formed in my mind. A chilling certainty. This wasn't just a panic attack or a moment of stage fright. He was trying to draw me in. If I did nothing, I would look cold, uncaring, the brutal rival who watched him fall. The optics would be terrible. It would confirm every stereotype about me. The calculated, ruthless competitor. But if I did step in, if I broke protocol, he could use it. He could turn my act of assistance into a political weakness, a public bailout. Max had to step in because I got him to crack under pressure. Something like that. I could almost hear the headline. He was setting a trap, daring me to walk into it. He was betting on my predictable ruthlessness. He was betting that my instinct would be to watch and wait. And in that moment, I knew his plan. The unspoken challenge wasn't just for me to act. It was for me to choose between two bad options. Do nothing and look like a villain, or do something and play right into his hands. Across the room, Lando Norris was also watching. His expression was a study in controlled concern. Lando was the protege of the establishment. His family's connections ran deep, weaving through the very fabric of British motorsports and beyond. He was never brash or openly confrontational. His power came from being a part of the elite, from understanding the subtle codes and signals of this world. His loyalty, I knew, was to the system and to his own ascent within it. He wasn't a threat like Lewis, who stood on a public platform. Lando was a threat from the inside out, a quiet force of gravity. I caught his eye. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head. It was a warning. Don't do it, Max. Don't fall for it. He saw the trap too, but his reasoning was different. Lando would never have walked into it because his entire strategy was to avoid such messy, unpredictable confrontations. He'd wait for the dust to settle, then quietly align himself with the winning side. It was a strategy that had worked for him his entire life. But I wasn't Lando. My career, my life, had been built on taking the unconventional path, on outsmarting my opponents by doing the very thing they thought I wouldn't do. The public stage was a lie. The real game was played in the shadows, in the split-second decisions that nobody ever saw coming. I had a choice to make. The clock was ticking. The awkward silence was now a tangible, living thing, devouring the atmosphere of the gala. A few people were now whispering, their hushed tones like the hiss of a fuse. The FIA president, standing near the stage, looked panicked. This was a disaster for the organization. The solution hit me with the force of a cold jolt. It wasn't about saving Lewis, it wasn't about looking good, it was about controlling the narrative, but in a way that nobody, not Lewis, not Lando, not the entire establishment, would have ever anticipated. My father had a saying, when they expect you to turn right, you slam on the brakes and make them crash into your rear bumper. It was a blunt, almost crude metaphor, but it was at the core of my competitive philosophy. Lewis had laid a trap, a very clever one. He expected me to do nothing and look bad, or to do something and get played. But there was a third option. A move that would not only neutralize his trap, but turn his perceived moment of weakness into a show of collective strength that would leave him with nowhere to go. I took a deliberate step forward. The whispers stopped. All eyes were on me now. Lewis's expression shifted, a flicker of something new, surprise mixed with a grudging respect. He knew I was making a move, but he didn't know what it was. I could feel Lando's eyes on me too, his curiosity now tinged with a faint disapproval. He would have handled this differently, of course. He would have let the system manage the problem. But I wasn't here to manage. I was here to redefine. I didn't walk towards the podium. Instead, I walked to the side of the hall where the screens were mounted, the ones that showed the various logos of the sponsors and partners. I caught the eye of a young, visibly nervous technical assistant who was standing near a control panel. He was the only person in the room who wasn't focused on Lewis. I spoke to him, my voice low and firm. "Can you put the main screen on the podium, on a wide shot?" He looked at me, bewildered, then at the president, who was too flustered to give a command. I gave him a nod, a silent order. He hesitated for only a second before his fingers moved over the keyboard. The main screen, a massive LED panel behind Lewis, flickered and then showed a live, wide-angle feed of the stage. The view wasn't on Lewis alone, but included the whole setup, the empty chairs, the official logos, the backdrop, everything. The crowd stirred. Whispers turned to a murmur of confusion. What was I doing? I wasn't saving Lewis. I was just changing the camera angle. Then, I walked back to my spot by the window. I didn't approach the podium. I didn't offer a hand. I didn't say a word. I just stood there, my arms crossed, watching the screen. The wide shot showed Lewis, still frozen, but it also showed the rest of the stage, the emptiness and the awkwardness. It was a public and undeniable display of his vulnerability. Lewis's eyes, still locked with mine, now showed a different emotion. Confusion. He hadn't expected this. He had expected me to either let him twist in the wind or to step up and give him the political leverage he craved. I had done neither. I had simply reframed the entire situation. The silence was no longer about him. It was about the space around him, the void. The silence was now a shared, collective experience, a testament to the strange, unyielding moment we were all a part of. This was the first part of the play. I had taken his personal crisis and made it a shared one. The media would now show not just Lewis's failure, but the entire scene, the awkwardness of the elite, the vacuum of leadership. He couldn't claim a victory from this. He couldn't say I had stepped in to help him. I hadn't. I had simply adjusted the view, forcing everyone to look at the whole picture. It was a move so subtle, so non-aggressive, it was almost invisible. And in that, it was perfect. I looked at Lando, who was now watching me with a new speculative expression. He understood. He saw the chess move for what it was, a brilliant, low-risk, high-reward gambit. I hadn't given Lewis an inch of political leverage. Instead, I had exposed the system's own fragility, its inability to handle a simple human moment. I had challenged the institution itself. Lewis was still frozen, but I knew what was coming next. He was a champion. He wouldn't stay silent forever. He would find his way out. But when he did, I would be ready. The stage was still his, but the narrative? That was now in my hands. I hadn't solved his problem, but I had made it impossible for him to turn it into my problem. And that was the only victory that mattered. Lewis blinked. Once, twice. The silence held, but it had changed. It was no longer a personal spotlight of shame. My move, so simple and yet so effective, had turned it into a collective problem. The wide shot on the main screen showed the awkward shuffle of the crowd, the flustered expression on the FIA president's face, and the vast empty space around the podium. The narrative wasn't Lewis Hamilton stumbles, it was the entire system is paralyzed by a single moment of human vulnerability. It was the kind of crisis the PR teams in this room were paid millions to prevent. Lewis, a man accustomed to having an answer for everything, was visibly thrown. The confidence that had defined his public persona for years was replaced by a flicker of genuine bewilderment. He had expected me to be a predictable variable in his equation. I had proven him wrong. The unspoken challenge had been issued, and I had returned it with a rhetorical flourish he couldn't counter. He finally spoke, his voice hoarse, a stark contrast to the smooth cadence from moments before. "Thank you, Max." The words hung in the air, a concession, a reluctant acknowledgement of my intervention. The crowd stirred, a collective release of breath. The spell was broken. Lewis had found his footing, but he was standing on ground I had created for him. He gestured to the FIA president, who rushed to the podium, taking the microphone and quickly announcing an unscheduled break. The escape hatch had been opened, but not before everyone in the room saw who had held the key. I watched Lewis descend from the podium, his posture still straight, but his movements lacking their usual fluid confidence. He made his way to a secluded corner of the hall, near a velvet curtain that concealed a private antechamber. He was a champion in retreat. I knew he wouldn't want to deal with the public sympathy or the political vultures. He would need a moment to collect himself, to process what had just happened. I walked toward him. This was the moment for the next move. This wasn't about gloating. This was about leveraging a sudden, unexpected advantage. As I approached, I saw Lando emerge from the crowd, a concerned look on his face. He was heading for Lewis too, but his pace was different. Less like an antagonist, more like a concerned friend, a fellow member of the establishment coming to check on his own. I knew what his move would be, to offer a quiet word of support, to show loyalty, to reassert his position within the inner circle. He was a master of political triage. But I wasn't going to let him get there first. I intercepted Lewis before Lando could. I stepped in front of him, blocking his path to the private room. Lewis stopped, his expression a complicated mix of frustration and something I couldn't quite read. "What was that?" he asked, his voice low, his eyes scanning the room, making sure no one was close enough to listen in. "You tell me," I said, my own voice calm, even. "You walked into it, Lewis. The whole thing was a setup. The public failure, the silent challenge. You wanted me to play the villain, to stand by and watch you fall, or even better, to get played by stepping in and giving you the upper hand." Lewis didn't deny it. He just stared at me, a grudging respect in his eyes. He saw the chessboard. He knew I had read his play. "And what was that?" He gestured back to the main screen. "A display of generosity? Or a new form of power play?" "Neither," I said. "It was a message, not to you, not to me, but to them." I nodded toward the hall, where the wealthy and powerful were now milling about, buzzing with questions. A message that their script is fragile, that their control is an illusion. You were the main act, the perfect symbol, and you almost broke under the pressure. I just showed them what happens when their perfect little show goes off the rails. Lando arrived, his face a mask of polite concern. "Lewis, are you all right? That was tough. Max, good on you for whatever that was." He spoke to Lewis, but his eyes were on me, trying to figure out the game. "I'm fine," Lewis said, a flicker of his old self-assurance returning. "Just a moment of technical difficulty." "Right," Lando said, a tight smile on his face. He was playing the part, the dutiful ally. He knew this was a moment to gain favor. "Look, we should all probably get together. The board is meeting in the antechamber. We need to handle this. The PR is going to be a nightmare." Lewis looked at him, then at me. Lando was offering a hand back into the fold, a return to the established order, the safe option. But I was offering something else, a new path, a new negotiation. "No," I said, not to Lando, but to Lewis. "This isn't about PR. This is about power. Your speech was about justice, about changing the system from within. But what just happened? The system panicked. It had no idea how to handle a single moment of real, unscripted humanity. Lando wants to get back in there and smooth things over, to put the masks back on, to pretend nothing happened. I want to see what happens when the masks come off completely." Lando's smile vanished. He saw what I was doing. I was driving a wedge, right between him and Lewis, right between Lewis and his established allies. I was forcing him to choose. The predictable path back to the embrace of the elite, or a risky, unpredictable alliance with me. "What are you proposing, Max?" Lewis asked, his voice hardening, a new sharpness in his eyes. He wasn't scared anymore. He was intrigued. He saw the opening, the same way a driver sees a gap in the traffic on the last lap. "I'm not proposing anything," I said. "I'm observing. We both want the same thing, Lewis, on a fundamental level. We both want a sport that's fair, that's just. We just have different ways of getting there. You want to change it with grand speeches and public statements. I want to change it by breaking the system from the inside out. Tonight, we just proved that the system is brittle. It can't handle a single crack. We don't need to put the pieces back together. We need to find out how deep the cracks go." Lewis looked from me to Lando, who was now a silent observer, his polite mask replaced by a look of wary calculation. Lando's world, a world of smooth transitions and careful alliances, was being challenged by a raw display of disruptive power. My power. I wasn't just a rival, I was a new force. "And what's the quid pro quo, Max?" Lewis asked, stepping closer to me, lowering his voice even further. "You don't do this for free. This isn't charity." "You're right," I said, meeting his gaze directly. "It's a transaction. The system wants you to sign off on their new regulations, the ones that are going to put more money in their pockets and less power in the hands of the teams and the drivers, the ones Lando's been so careful to stay silent about. They need your voice to sell it, to make it sound like it's for a good cause. They need their star." Lewis's eyes narrowed. He knew the regulations I was talking about. We all did. They were the elephant in the room. Publicly, the talk was all about fairness and leveling the playing field. But behind closed doors, they were a power grab. Lando's silence on the issue had been noted by everyone. It was a sign of his loyalty to the very structures I was challenging. "So what's your play?" Lewis asked. "We don't say a word," I said. "You and I. We don't endorse it, we don't talk about it, we let them think they have us. And then, at the very moment they think they're about to get the signatures they need, we break this so-called brittle alliance and speak out. Together." Lewis paused, processing the audacity of the plan. It was a complete reversal. He wasn't being asked to lend his voice to a new movement. He was being asked to weaponize his silence, to use his carefully cultivated platform to create a void, a vacuum of support that would leave the FIA and its backers exposed. It was a high-risk, high-reward strategy. It wasn't just about winning a race. It was about changing the rules of the game itself, and he would have to trust me, his greatest rival, to do it. Lando, who had been listening intently, finally spoke up, a new urgency in his voice. "Lewis, this is reckless. You can't trust him. He's just trying to undermine the whole thing for his own benefit." "Maybe," Lewis said, his eyes still on mine. "Or maybe he's just playing a different game." He looked back at Lando. "A game where you're not on the board, Lando. A game that goes beyond what they teach you at the old boys club." Lando's face hardened. My move had done more than just save Lewis. It had created a schism. It had exposed the old alliances and the new power brokers. The public stage was broken. The unspoken challenge had been met. And in its place, a brittle alliance had been formed, fragile, distrustful, but absolutely necessary. The real fight was just beginning. The next few weeks were a masterclass in silent warfare. Lewis and I maintained our public appearances with a shared, unspoken understanding. We attended the required meetings, smiled for the cameras, and gave the perfunctory sound bites the media craved. But behind the scenes, we were a unified front of total, absolute silence. The FIA and its corporate allies, expecting our public endorsement of the new regulations, found nothing. Not a single word. They tried to get us to comment, to make an offhand remark, to even just acknowledge the proposals in a positive light, but we stonewalled them completely. Our silence was a weapon, and it was cutting them to shreds. This was the core of the brittle alliance. We were two competing forces, born of different worlds, now working together with a single, fragile purpose. Our communication was terse, often conducted through encrypted channels or in brief, private moments where we could speak without being overheard. There was no warmth, no camaraderie, just a shared mission. He was the most famous public figure on the planet, and I was the one who had finally given him a fight he couldn't win with just rhetoric. He knew my plan was working, and I knew he respected me for it, even if he would never admit it. Lando, meanwhile, was in his own private hell. He was a creature of the system, a man who believed that quiet diplomacy and alignment were the only ways to win. Our public silence was a direct affront to everything he stood for. I saw him at a few events, his face a mask of controlled fury and frustration. He tried to get in Lewis's ear, to offer him a deal, to persuade him to come back to the fold. But Lewis held firm. My strategy had created a new axis of power in the sport, one that bypassed the old guard completely. Lando wasn't just on the outside looking in. He was watching his entire world crumble. The media, naturally, was in a frenzy. The whispers from the gala had turned into a full-blown rumor mill. Why were Lewis and Max being so quiet? Was it a feud? A secret negotiation? No one could figure it out. The vacuum of information was filled with wild speculation, and the pressure on the FIA to get our endorsement grew more intense by the day. The breaking point came at the final press conference before the vote on the regulations. All the team principals, the FIA president, and the key drivers were there. The air was charged with a kind of electric tension. Everyone knew this was where the public narrative would be shaped for the vote. The FIA president got up and delivered a rousing speech about the future of the sport, about sustainability, and about the new regulations being the key to a fairer, more equitable championship. He didn't mention us by name, but everyone in the room knew he was speaking directly to us, trying to force our hand. He finished his speech, and then, with a flourish, he pointed to a large screen behind the podium. And now, we have a message from two of the sport's greatest champions, a message of unity and support for this incredible new era. My blood ran cold. Lewis, sitting next to me, stiffened. We hadn't recorded any such message. This was a trap, a classic move by the establishment. They were going to play a doctored video, maybe use old sound bites to make it seem like we had endorsed them. It was a desperate, unethical gamble to save their plan. They were betting that we wouldn't call them out in front of the entire world. They were betting on the old rules of decorum. But Lewis and I had already broken those rules. The brittle alliance was about to snap. The screen flickered on. It was a video montage of Lewis and me, on the track, in press conferences, our voices edited together to create a seamless, fabricated endorsement. The words were generic, a collage of moving forward, unity, and a better future. It was a cheap, transparent trick. But in a world where perception was reality, it could have worked. A gasp went through the crowd. Lando, sitting a few seats away, looked at me with a smirk. He thought they had me. He thought the old guard had won. He believed that even with our silence, we would be outmaneuvered by the very system we were trying to disrupt. But he and they had forgotten one thing. We were no longer playing their game. Lewis stood up. It was an instant gut reaction. The FIA president, who had been about to step off the podium, looked at him with an expression of panicked confusion. Lewis walked to the microphone, his face a perfect picture of quiet fury. "That video," he said, his voice quiet but commanding, "is a lie." The room erupted in a storm of gasps and whispers. The FIA president stepped forward to cut him off, but Lewis held up a hand. "You ask for unity, but you resort to manipulation. You talk about a fair future, but you use old tricks and fabricated messages to get your way. I did not record that video. Max did not record that video, and you all know it." Then I stood up. I walked to the podium and stood beside Lewis. It was the first time we had ever stood side by side in a public forum, not as rivals, but as a united front. "The truth is," I said, my voice cutting through the rising noise, "we are not silent because we have nothing to say. We are silent because we are waiting for something real to support. These regulations aren't about a better future. They're about taking power from the teams and the drivers and giving it to a select few. We won't be a part of that." The press conference became pure chaos. Team principals were on their phones, reporters were shouting questions, and the FIA president was trying desperately to regain control of a situation that had spiraled completely out of his hands. And that's when the unforeseen consequence hit. It wasn't just about Lewis and me. It was about the entire ecosystem of the sport. The Brittle Alliance had just shattered the very foundation of the establishment. The live cameras were broadcasting this unfiltered, raw moment of rebellion to the entire world. A young driver, one who had been struggling with his team's budget, stood up. "They're right," he shouted. "We can't race if we can't afford to compete. The regulations don't help us, they kill us." And then another, and another. Soon, a handful of drivers and a few team principals from smaller teams were on their feet, their voices joining the growing chorus of dissent. It wasn't just a challenge from Lewis and me anymore. It was a revolution. Our Brittle Alliance had inspired others. The silence had not just protected us, it had become a signal, a beacon for everyone else who felt marginalized and powerless. I looked at Lando. He was still in his seat, his face pale with shock. He had believed in the system. He had played by its rules. And in this single moment, his entire strategy, his entire world had been proven to be a lie. My move had not only outsmarted Lewis, it had exposed the vulnerability of the entire elite. The unforeseen consequence was that the public challenge didn't end with us. It was a fuse, lit at the FIA gala, that was now detonating in every corner of the sport. We hadn't just changed the rules, we had inspired a movement. The regulations were voted down. The FIA was forced to go back to the drawing board. And in the days that followed, Lewis and I, once rivals on the very brink of a political war, stood on a new kind of podium. We spoke to the press, not with carefully crafted statements, but with a new, shared truth. The Brittle Alliance had served its purpose. It was over. But in its place, a new, more enduring understanding had been forged. We had proven that power wasn't just about winning on the track, or even winning in a meeting room. It was about controlling the narrative, understanding the game better than anyone else, and sometimes, the only way to move forward was to tear it all down and build something new.